Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the space. Today's episode is actually going to be the first in hopefully a long line of interviews that is going to, well, as I said, be interviews. I cover many different topics in this podcast, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of what we're going to talk about in terms of intersecting topics. And as is very appropriate with this topic being multifaceted, including lots of different perspectives and experiences, I wanted to introduce you guys to my friend Freddie, who is going to be talking about his experience with our topic for this week, which is asexuality and gender. Freddie, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the space and talk about your experience. I am very glad to have you here.
My pleasure. Hello, everybody. My name's Freddie, and I am also asexual.
So I am going to be asking Freddie some questions that I have pre-generated and okayed with him, and it's going to give a little bit of insight into his experience as a person who identifies as asexual. So as our topic for this week is asexuality and gender, I wanted to start and just ask you, first, for your own experience, how do you define asexuality?
If it's based on just my experience, I would say asexuality is the absence, or I would say rarity of sexual attraction. So the scarcity of sexual attraction, I think I would say.
That aligns with the definitions that I have found in my research. So at what point do you think that you realized that you may have been asexual?
Well, I think I knew I was asexual well before I knew what asexuality was. So I didn't really know what to call it, but I did know that I was asexual. I'd say growing up, I remember in elementary school, it was always the cool thing to do among the boys at my school, where if we were to watch a movie or a TV show where any of the characters were kissing, then the whole class, not just the boys, but the whole class would go, ew, gross. And then we would always talk about how the girls have cooties, because that's, I'm dating myself a little bit there, but I was in elementary school in the time of cooties. And that was just like a whole thing during elementary school. And I remember I didn't think the girls were gross, but I did like shy away from the idea of kissing and the idea of having a partner, etc. And then when we got to middle school, there was this shift. There was this paradigm shift as like a community, where instead of it being cool to be to find it gross, it was all of a sudden like, oh, who are you taking to the roller derby this weekend? Like all the cool kids do. And I at that point still was like, I'm never gonna get married. Like I never phased out of it's cool to not end up with a partner, because I don't have the drive to do so like the other kids do. And then around high school time, in middle school into high school, is when everybody got horny simultaneously. And I was left out of the transition from being an elementary school kid who was like, oh, kissing is gross but interesting, to please let sex happen to me, and talking about all the different things that you would do, and watching different things, etc., etc. So for me, I'm going way out of the way here to answer this question,
Which is perfect.
But for me, when I was a kid, I always, in middle school, I always realized that I was participating in conversations differently than other guys, and they would tend to hinge around who they found attractive in the grade, and who they wanted to hook up with. That was always a conversation. Who hooked up with who, and who would you hook up with? And there was a ranking system and everything. And I remember feeling so left out of those conversations, just because I was like, I am not driven to do that. I always felt like it was, I felt the same way about talking about sex as I did about talking about shoes or cars. I never got into shoes and cars like most of the guys in my age group. Pokemon cards, on the other hand, that I could talk about. But when it came to shoes and cars, and sex, it was just something that I would be in the conversation for, but always as a spectator. So I knew I was asexual. And I knew I was different. And then I remember in high school, there was a time when it got to a point where I Googled, like, I was like, is there, like, I do not want sex. Why not? Like, it was literally just a Google search of, like, what is wrong with me was the idea. And I think it was a Reddit post. I found an asexual subreddit.
Always goes back to Reddit.
Right. And I started looking at the posts that were made there, and I started looking at the definitions of things, and it was just the description of, like, oh, yeah, you can be, like, that was when I figured out what asexual was, and it was also when I figured out what aromantic was. And I looked at aromantic, and I was like, that's not really me, but the asexual definitions, like, I never felt more seen. It was like a puzzle piece that I knew was there, but I couldn't see, finally fell into place. So that is my very long-winded explanation. That is when I identified myself as asexual officially, was that time.
That's awesome. That definitely makes sense. I think we all can understand that middle school is the time for change and the time for growth.
Your body's going through a lot of changes all at once.
Yep. And it can be very uniting. It can also be very isolating for those who may experience the world a little different than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so that definitely aligns with different experiences in terms of finding the term asexuality way after having or, experiencing these feelings of otherness and maybe isolation from the horny conversation.
Right. And Kelly, you and I have talked about, like, the idea of, like, I had no idea what these terms meant, to the point where it was, like, embarrassing when I tried to participate in conversations where we're like, learning about asexuality was something I had to go out of my way to find. Like, it's not something that's talked about or taught about. I had the opportunity to have the speech of, like, when you grow up and you meet a man or a woman that you would fall in love with, then you would get married. Like, that was the lesson that I learned. But learning that there was a possibility of, like, never having that level of intimacy. Like, when you have the talk, it is a talk about, here's what sex is like. You're going to have these urges one day. Heads up. And then for me, I was like, no, gross. And then later on, everybody else was like, well, actually. And I was still like, no, it's kind of weird. I'm okay.
Yeah, nobody ever talks about, as you said, it's always the sex talk about this is what sex is, this is what sex does, and as your body is changing, these are some things you may start to feel. But there's very little conversation around, okay, well, what if I never feel that way?
Right.
What if I never feel those urges? And that can definitely inform someone's perspective when they're surrounded by people sharing those experiences, because I think everyone is a little too open in middle school.
Right.
Learn about and talk about it and inform and grow different perspectives.
Right.
So this week we focus specifically on asexuality and gender, that intersection. And so you identify as an asexual man.
Right.
And so I am wondering, how has your gender impacted the way, just your gender, impacted the way you see the world outside of asexuality?
Outside of asexuality. I don't know. That's a very complex question, because truly that's something that you could unpack through the entirety of development, right? So, like, that could be something that still impacts me today. So I don't know. I guess a quick way to do it is, outside of asexuality, there's an expectation as a man. There's the expectation that you exude boyhood in your adolescence, and then as an adult, you exude masculinity. So there's this shift from boyhood to masculine, like the phases is a shift. So, like, for boyhood, it's the expectation, like, oh, the boys will be boys mentality. Like, you're supposed to make bad decisions, which for the record I did. But there's always the expectation that as a boy you are a troublemaker, and as a boy you're going to chase the girls around on the playground as a weird way of flirting. And then there's the idea that as a man, you are expected to have the economic status successes as an adult, and you are expected to be the provider, and you are expected to find a wife and settle down, right? So I feel like that is definitely something that changes things for me. I don't really know how to answer any more specifically than that, just because we could be here forever. But
that's okay. We can look, as you answered the first question and now to the second question, we can either look very broadly about a whole timeline of experiences, or we can look very generally. Mm-hmm. And I feel like what you said, completely validates the idea of expectations put on not just men but young boys in, I would argue, a very allistic and allosexual and heterosexual perspective, especially growing up in a movement towards accepting queer identities. That expectation follows that very allosexual and heteronormative narrative. Mm-hmm. So then, now looking at asexuality, if we take those two pieces apart, mm-hmm. how do you think your asexuality has impacted the way you see the world?
Pretty drastically. And we're keeping these separate, right? We're not talking about the intersection between asexuality and gender, or should I be touching on that?
Not quite yet. Okay. So when I asked you how you identify and at what point you realized your asexuality, that we talked about back in middle school and back when you were younger. Let's talk a little bit more recently. Are there things that you have noticed where you're like, this is a big part of...
in my day-to-day, right?
It could be day-to-day. It could also be broader scale, of, as we've discussed.
Sure. Yeah. Well, then in that case, I've got a ton. I think for me, in terms of my current perspective on the world, I have a difficulty understanding the heteronormative perspective. So a lot of allosexual people tend to talk about, or my allosexual friends that I talk to, have this sense of disbelief where they're like, I cannot believe you do not have this sex drive, or I cannot believe you do not feel this consistently horny. And I remember for a time, I remember when I came out to my friend group, there was an ongoing joke that I was going to asexually reproduce. Like, if I wanted a kid, I was gonna clone myself just by willing it to happen. Mm-hmm. Which, to be fair, is what I thought. That's how I thought it worked when I was a kid. So maybe I just try really hard.
Like a fungi.
I am a fungi. Yeah, I've been told often. But you can't be too much of a fungi, because then there's not much room for other entertainers at the party. So the idea of allosexual people seeing an asexual person and having that question of how do you have so little sex drive, or how do you not feel horny? And my perspective as an asexual person is I go shopping for gifts for my partner on Amazon, and I'm just partner anniversary gifts, and then the whole first couple pages is just full of throw pillows with sexual innuendos on them, or matching lingerie sets, or toys, all sorts of different things that I'm just I just want a t-shirt that says I love you, or something like that. And then I have to be more specific than the broad of partner gifts. It has to be something like teddy bear with a heart.
There's an assumption to what you're saying. There's an assumption that if you're getting a gift for your romantic partner, mm-hmm. it has to be sexual in some way.
Right. So yeah, I would say it shapes it in the way that you tend to assume it's like being a tall person in a world built for smaller people. The world is built and designed around the idea that you subscribe to what is the societal and sexual norm. And so by differing from that, it's truly not heavily noticeable. but it's that slight, like, you have to duck to get through a door. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's not like particularly difficult, but you notice it.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, like a very complementary metaphor to what we're talking about, where, as you said, it may not be aggressively in your face all the time, but you have to stoop to, like, go through a door, as you said. Mm-hmm. And it's the everyday microisms that just make it a little bit weirder and more uncomfortable to live in an allosexual world as an asexually identifying person.
Right.
So now we can talk a little holistically, if you would like. Sure. And so tell me about, maybe if there are any specifics at all or any examples at all that you can provide about how your identity as a man, as well as someone who is asexual, has impacted your perception of the world and your experiences.
Right. Well, there's definitely a lot to say about this topic. So again, I talked with that first question about how being a man and growing up around other boys tended to leave me as the odd one out in conversations, where it would be jokes running around about who you wanted to hook up with, or who you wanted to have relations with, or who was the most attractive in the grade. And I felt left out of those conversations. And it wasn't necessarily anything that anyone was doing intentionally, but it was considered the norm. And I still remember it was weird. It felt like I was undercover, because I had classmates who were gay, right? And they were openly gay. But because they were gay, they were left out of those conversations, or they were left out of those groups. But I was still welcome in those groups because it was assumed that I was also allosexual. Whereas you ask any of those kids in that group, none of us would know what that meant, including me. So I was in the group while being like, yeah, high five. What is happening right now? And so that would be, that was a good 5 years of my life. was just that kind of conversation. So yeah, and I remember it was so complicated. I hated explaining my asexuality because I couldn't just say, yeah, I'm asexual. I had to say, well, it's not like I don't like boys, and it's not like I don't like girls. Like, if I would probably date a girl if I had to, but at the same time, I don't want to, because I don't want to have sex, and I think it's uncomfortable and weird. But, I don't want to get married because it would be weird, and I just want to live in a hobbit hole with a bunch of fantasy decorations around. But at the same time, and it was just like this 5-paragraph essay just to explain this part of myself that I didn't even understand for myself. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know. I think the biggest thing is the fact that there's this expectation of this is the way you should behave. Like, as a man, you should be seeking a partner with the intent of having sex, and you should build a family. And of course, building a family starts with sex. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the quintessential. Like, literally, the stigma is you get married, and then the night of your wedding, you consecrate the marriage. Like, it is literally as traditional as marriage itself.
Yeah.
To the point where that is what is considered the norm. And as the man, typically men are, and again, this is my biased male perspective, but as a man, typically men are very outspoken about sex. And a lot of marketing is designed around male sex drive. There's a lot of commercials that you'll see of scantily clad women. And it is designed to appeal to male sex drives. And when I watch that, I'm just like, okay.
They look cold.
They look cold, exactly. Why are they dumping so much ice water on themselves? That must be really uncomfortable. And in that outfit? Really? But yeah, I think there is, and like the other part I would say is that there's this lack of understanding when you like come out to somebody, or you were like, yeah, I just don't have a sex drive. They're like, okay, yeah, so you haven't found it yet. And I'm like, no, I'm just not. It's not there.
It's not lost. It's like it was never there in the first place.
Exactly.
It's not
There's
like
nothing to find.
I've misplaced my sex drive today.
Exactly. So yeah, there was always that assumption, and I think I feel this sweet victory at this point, because in my whole high school years, it was always like, or in my middle school years, it was like, wait until you're in high school, and then in high school, it was like, oh, I was just like that too. Wait till you're in college. And then in college, they were like, why are you still here? And I think there was that sweet victory after the fact where I was just like, no, this is who I am.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing. I can't even imagine, that difficulty of being in such a male-centered, sex-focused world in terms of appealing to the outspoken male sex drive and to the outspoken, masculine expectation that is building a family and settling down. Always, of course, written in between the lines, including intercourse and including sex. How difficult it must have been to, and still must be, to navigate that kind of world, those kinds of expectations, as you said, kind of moving and shaping things in little silent ways. As you were, of course, moving and shaping the conversation between the middle school boys as a secret spy in little ways.
Right, super undercover.
Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned that it must have been very challenging. And I, as a kid, I don't think I ever would have guessed that. Like, I never would have been like, this is really hard. But I think as a kid, I would have said, this is really confusing. Like, nothing was more relieving than figuring out that there were other asexual people and that it was a thing. Because I spent my childhood thinking I was broken. Like, I spent my childhood thinking that this part of me was broken, I should specify. Like, I am missing something that should be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I never understood that. And I experimented romantically when I was growing up, and every time it was the face of, like, people could not understand that I didn't desire sex.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's such a foreign concept, which is fair. Because for me, again, sex itself is a rather foreign concept.
Mm-hmm.
And was a rather foreign concept. So there is a definite difficulty in understanding the perspective of another, especially because we didn't learn what asexuality was. Like, I mean, we learned straight gay. That was it. Those are your two options. You pick one box and then that's it.
Yeah.
So finding out that there were others, I didn't even know bisexuality was the thing, actually thinking about it. But yeah, there should be mandatory classes on LGBTQ, like understanding the difference between sex and gender and sexuality, and talking about that stuff, because I think a huge part of it is just the fact that people don't know what it means.
Mm-hmm. Education is a huge gap in terms of sexual education, more than just encouraging abstinence or celibacy. One is a form of birth control, and one is a form of being, in terms of allosexuality is the only valid or socially acceptable way to navigate the world. Because as you and I are sitting here, we know it's not. And we know that it is perfectly acceptable and amazing, truly, to identify in such a way. And I wanted to end this interview asking you actually the same question that I ask my audience at the end of every episode, about what your favorite thing is about your identity.
I think my favorite part about my identity is the confidence that I feel in knowing who I am. And being able, there is something incredibly powerful about being able to name something, whether it be asexuality or whether it be yourself, whether it be your name, right? And being able to go up to somebody and say, I am asexual, and know what that means. And then being able to explain to them what that means if they need to know it. But being able to confidently say, I am asexual, I am a man, I am sometimes funny once every 7 months or so, I am tall in a short person's world, right? Like, just being able to identify who I am and the confidence it brings me to know who I am. I think that is my favorite part of my identity, is being able to know not only that it shapes the world around me and the way I see it and the way the world sees me, but also to be able to be conscious of it and respond to it in kind.
That's a beautiful answer. And thank you for sharing that. There is, as you said again, such confidence that comes with such outward confidence, that comes from an internal confidence in knowing who you are and feeling open and curious and experiencing life in your particular way, however that may be. So thank you again for joining us here and for sharing your experiences.
My pleasure.
It was great to have you, so thank you, and I will see you all next time here at The Space.